Welcome to the Technology, Risk and Gambling podcast, produced by the Technology Addiction Team at the Brain and Mind Centre at the University of Sydney. I am Dr. Sally Gainsbury, a professor in psychology. This season is titled Informed Decisions, Financial Behaviour in Persuasive Digital Environments. Across these conversations, we're asking what it really takes for people to form intentions about money and follow through on them when the digital environments around them are designed to influence their behaviour. This season is supported by BetWell, a free independent analytics tool developed by our team to assist people who want to bet with more insight, intention and clarity. You can go to betwell.org.au. Today's episode asks the question of how the financial services sector, such as banks and lenders, play a role in being part of the solution to reduce gambling harm and help people be more aware and intentional with their decisions. My guest is Nikki Bond, who leads the Gambling Harm and Action Lab at the Money Mental Health Policy Institute in the UK. Nikki works directly at the intersection of gambling harm, mental health and financial services, specifically looking at what banks can do with the data and the relationships they already have. In today's episode, we talk about the importance of involving people with lived experience of gambling and gambling harm into the conversations of what banks can do to support people, as well as some of the policies and practices that banks and financial institutions can roll out to ensure that they are supporting people, providing signposts where is needed, and tools that people actually want to use to manage their gambling. Thanks for listening. Hello, Nikki. Welcome to the Technology, Risk and Gambling webinar series. I'm delighted to have you on here. For our audience, Nikki Bond leads the Gambling Harm Action Lab at the Money and Mental Health Policy Institute, which is a UK charity which has spent nearly a decade examining the intersection of mental health and financial difficulties. Nikki, I'd love for you to share some of the background around why your institute exists and what it's doing in the intersection of looking at financial services, government, and of course, the people who have lived experience to understand how financial systems affect mental health and how they could be doing better.
Yeah, of course. Thanks for having us on. So we're a charity that was founded 10 years ago by Martin Lewis. And for those who don't know who Martin Lewis is, he is a highly respected consumer journalist and champion over here in Great Britain. And he founded a website called Money Saving Expert and is a regular on TV and radio campaigning on issues of personal finance and consumer finance. So 10 years ago, Martin set us up because he recognised that mental health problems and financial difficulties were intricately linked. And people with mental health problems were more likely to have difficulties with their finances, and people in financial difficulties were more likely to have problems with their mental health problems. And that's where money and mental health were born. So over the past 10 years, we've been working across a range of sectors. So we have three strands to our work. We work across employment and benefit systems. We work across support services, health systems, debt advice services. And then finally, the section that we're concerned about today, we work with financial services and utility companies and essential services to really support people and think about how those services can better support people with mental health problems. And really, lots of the work in the essential services space really points at the fact that there's such a valuable touch point with people who have mental health problems and thinking about how they can make their services more accessible for people, but also how they can spot people and support people better.
And can you just elaborate exactly what you mean by financial services? Because I hear that, I think about, where I bank, or maybe where I have a mortgage from. But I understand the sector may be broader than this.
Yeah, absolutely. So we talk about all kind of credit products. We talk about kind of your current account, your banking products, but credit products as well. But the sector obviously is huge. That's where the banking sector is where our kind of focus has been to date, really. But there's lots of scope to go further than that. But for us at the moment, that's where the greatest support can be had for people, and that's where we focus our efforts really within kind of the traditional mainstream banking systems.
So that's banks where people might have a savings account or a credit account. Does it also include various institutes where they're borrowing money? So, short-term lenders, even buy now, pay later schemes.
Yeah, our kind of collaborative work is where we've worked with sort of banks, more current account and banks and providers of that nature. We've also done work with credit providers, and we've done work on sort of short-term lending, buy now, pay later, as you say. So there's lots of kind of strings to kind of what we do. But in the gambling part, which we'll talk about, our focus is with those current account providers.
Okay. And I also am interested in, the different types of banks, because in Australia, for example, there's sort of the big four lenders, and many countries have top banks, but there's also increasing neobanks coming up, some which don't even have physical premises, and they're particularly attractive to younger people and provide more innovative services than what traditional banking do. Is this an area that you're looking at?
Yeah, so obviously we've got some new challenger banks that have come on board in the UK over recent years, and have grown in popularity. And we're open to working with any financial services firm that wants to support people with mental health problems better. So we kind of wouldn't exclude any particular firm where we thought that our kind of mission was aligned on that particular issue. And I think it would be foolish of us just to stay aligned to kind of the main big five.
Yeah, absolutely. And obviously, there's so many intersections between mental health and financial difficulties, and there's so many different contexts that this is impacting people in terms of the debt, the benefits that they can serve, the cost of living. You have a specific focus on gambling. I was wondering why gambling specifically. There are so many different types of retail or commerce sectors. What makes gambling one of the focus areas?
So this kind of talks to our history, really. So when we set up 10 years ago, we launched with a huge survey that really looked to understand the nature of how mental health problems and financial difficulties were linked. And we got 10,000, I think, 10,000 people to complete that survey. And we did a huge piece of analysis to think about what are the initial issues that people are raising in this space. And they raised around employment benefits, debt advice, health systems, all of that sort of stuff. But what also came through was issues around gambling, which was where our gambling work started way back in 2016 when we launched. And then we went on and we kind of did lots of work in that space, and we thought about what tools banks could offer to people who are experiencing gambling harms, and our work has kind of evolved since then. Really, our work is centred in lived experience. So we've got a research community of 5,000 people with lived experience of mental health problems who are at the heart of everything we do. So we go out to our research community on a weekly basis to ask about all things money and mental health. And the prevalence of gambling coming up frequently throughout that is just really what's driven our work, and where we kind of thought there was a spot here for us to identify and do something with, and see how we can amplify those voices and how we can work with the different sectors to make change. So it's really been driven by the lived experience, and then thinking about, okay, how can we drive this forward and affect change, which is how the Gambling Harms Action Lab was born, really.
That's incredible, because it brings that richness, which things like transaction data, which there have been some analyses of banking transaction data by groups like Naomi Muggleton's group, Kazra and Gagarian at UNLV are looking at transaction data from banks. But your lived experience and being able to hear those voices and those stories tells a story that we just can't get from transaction data. I was wondering if you could share a little bit more around some of those stories, not obviously the specifics of each story, but is there a pattern by which, when you see this interrelation between financial difficulties and gambling, you see that the gambling is leading to the financial difficulties, or people experiencing financial difficulties are gambling as a way to address those? What do you tend to be seen, or what are some of the different types of patterns or stories that you've come across?
Yeah, it like from your own work, we know it works both ways. That financial difficulties, in some instances, will lead to people gambling. So people maybe some of the stories we've heard from our research community is around they were already in financial difficulties, and actually gambling seemed this way out. And maybe if I gamble and I get a win, I can get out of this financial difficulty. And I've heard some really difficult stories around that. But then you've also got the piece where people have got low mood and anxiety and depression, and where gambling has been a pastime that they've engaged in, which has been a distraction from that or a comfort during that period. But then that has led to those difficulties. So we see both sides of that. I think the thing that stands out to me so much is, because many of mental health works at this intersection of mental health problems and financial difficulties, how much people are already in financial difficulties, and then they're engaging in gambling behaviours for whatever the driver, and how much often people see it as a way out of those financial difficulties, and how difficult that is, because then that entrenches those problems, and it doesn't obviously lead to the way out of those financial difficulties. So I think that's the bit that comes up time and time again and feels incredibly hard for people. And you think about what a huge opportunity you have with banks who can see financial difficulties, who can see vulnerability, and how they can support people better and try to disrupt these pathways where people want the support, or where it might be useful.
That's actually really interesting, that later point of, are people aware of what they're doing? Are they thinking, and it is completely rational. I definitely want to come from a place of empowering people that if you need money in a short period of time, there are very few legal ways to go about getting it, and gambling is a legal way that might seem like the only possible way to progress something for people. But that that is, something that banks can see in real time. And I would say banks have almost a unique
Yeah.
insight. Obviously the gambling operators as well, but the banks can see like they can see maybe some evidence of how much money is in the account, or maybe any indicators of financial difficulties like minimum payments or late fines, things like this. Can you tell me a little bit more around what you know about what can the banks see, or to what extent are these kind of behaviors apparent in banking data? Is it there and banks see it? Is it there the banks aren't looking for it? Can you shed any light on that?
So banks can see every penny and pound we spend, but that's a given. What they look for is the big question here. So they can see when we're in financial difficulties. They can see when we're in our overdrafts, or when we've not got enough money to pay our bills towards the end of the month, or direct debits are bounced. And so they can also see where we're making gambling transactions, where those gambling transactions might be coming before we pay our rent each month, or they might be coming straight after payday, or they might be out of our overdraft facility, or they might be taking us into an unauthorized overdraft facility. Banks routinely look for is different. So they can see all of that, but they might not routinely be running systems to look for those things. So one of the things we've been working with the firms that are part of the Gambling Hubs Action Lab is how you can spot what behavioural signs you might spot for somebody who might be experiencing or at risk of gambling harms, and what financial or spending indicators there might be, and then what affordability indicators. So really thinking across those three themes: spending indicators, behavioural indicators, and affordability indicators, how banks can begin to build up a picture of people and their circumstances, and then how they offer support out to them. This isn't about going out to people and saying, this is what you shouldn't be spending your money on. That's very much not the premise of our organisation or banks. People are free to spend their money how they choose. But I think, to your point earlier, people often don't know how much they're spending on things. You know, if you ask me how much I spent on coffee last month, I'd probably struggle to give you a clear answer. And certainly when you come into something, and lots of your work looks at this, when you come into something around gambling, people's ability to look back and estimate or judge how much they've spent is really tricky. And I think banks have a really important role here to help people understand that. And you're beginning to see some of that, where banks are providing spending insights and things across a range of spending, which all helps the consumer make more informed decisions.
Definitely. I think I've been saying the same thing, that online gambling does pose unique risks to individuals. It can be really immersive and obscure how much time you're spending, but it has some key advantages, including that it gives you an exact track of how much money you're spending, exactly what you're winning and what you're losing, what you're turning over, that you don't get with cash-based gambling. It's not something that's currently set up to track. So people should be able to use their bank accounts as a centralized place of tracking all this information and using it, but it's often it's hidden in the transactions. It's not obvious to people, but the banks could be looking at that. Obviously, there are some technical difficulties in relation to things like merchant codes and if people are using sites that aren't listed as gambling operators. But your recent reports, published late last year, the First Line of Defence, specifically looked at how transaction data can be used by banks to support customers at risk of harm. Can you tell me what you've what's technically possible, what banks are currently doing? And I'm also really interested in something you looked at in terms of the difference between identifying risk and identifying harm.
What banks can see, as I touched on earlier, are rather spending indicators, affordability indicators, and behavioural indicators. So take behavioural indicators. They can see if somebody is binge gambling throughout the night. They can, or if they can see if somebody is making quick payments in quick succession. So there's real clear indicators there, and you link that back to the evidence about binge gambling or nighttime gambling, which all poses higher risk. Then you've got things around spending indicators. So one of the things we know, gambling operators have spend thresholds whereby they have to do warning checks. Whereas those spending thresholds are pretty high. They're not unique to the individual. Whereas, in current accounts, you can see somebody's gambling spend proportionate to their income. So particularly where they get their payments paid into that account. So you can do something a little bit more bespoke. You can take what their gambling spend is and look at how much that is as a percentage of their disposable income, which gives you a much more nuanced look. It's really, I think you could take the financial risk check guideline of £125 that we have at the moment, which operators use. But for somebody on universal credit, that represents nearly 50% of their basic benefits. So really, that's the harm that is likely to be caused there is huge, versus someone on a minimum wage or the average wage that presents a much lower proportion. So there's just huge amounts that banks can see there. And then when you look at the affordability piece, they can really see your gambling within the context of the rest of your credit behaviour, around your loans and your credit use and your overdraft facilities and how close you are to your overdraft each month, and different things like that, or if you've got direct debits bouncing. So it just feels like, so they've got this unique lens, but then they also have this lens of this cross-operator lens. So if people are, whilst operators have one lens and they've got these checks that they're doing at that level, your bank can see all of the people that all of the operators you're gambling with, and they've got an opportunity to intervene in that space, really, and really to help you understand or help you kind of see how much you're spending. And some people might not want that, but giving people the option to see it, to help them make the decisions, more informed decisions. And I think if we can offer people those types of tools earlier on, there's an opportunity to disrupt the pathways to escalating gambling harms.
Yeah, definitely. And maybe that's the difference between where a pattern of behavior indicates that there might be some risk going on versus where that risky behavior is going on in the context of financial difficulties that may be
Yeah.
indicating this really is contributing to. We won't, be talking about causal necessarily, but if someone's already clearly exhibiting indicators of financial difficulty, and there's gambling at high levels or levels that are likely contributing to difficult financial difficulties. Is that are there any obligations for banks or policies? I'm wondering what the difference is as well is between what banks could do and where action actually is being taken.
Here in the UK, banks are regulated by the Financial Conduct Authority. And 3 years ago, a new piece of regulation came in called the Consumer Duty, which is a principle-based piece of regulation that requires banks to ensure good outcomes for customers, among many other things, and support customers to make informed decisions and different principles. The consumer duty has been huge in our work with gambling harms. So I think one of the things that the consumer duty says is about supporting people to prevent foreseeable harm. Gambling harms is a foreseeable harm. When you can see that people are spending more than they can afford, when you can see that they are gambling in an unauthorized overdraft facility, there is foreseeable harm that you can support people to prevent. And I think it's about being clear about what the bank's role is in highlighting this, and then what's down to consumer choice. So I think one of the things when we set up the Gambling Harms Action Lab, there was I think from banks they don't want to understandably be seen as being paternalistic to people. People are able to do as they choose with their money. But this is about supporting people to manage their money in a way that they would like to do, or their best self would like to do, maybe, and giving them the tools to do that. So this isn't about saying you can't gamble, we're going to put blocks on your account without your consent. This is about offering people tools that help them manage their own gambling. And that might be that somebody wants to abstain from gambling entirely, in which case here in the UK, you could put a bank gambling block on your account, which allows you to abstain from all forms of legal gambling. Whereas the thing that we've been working with firms around is, what other tools do you have for people who might not want to abstain but might want to gamble within their own perceived safer limits? So, for example, I might want to say, okay, I still want to gamble, but I only want to gamble £20 a week or something like that. So allowing people to do that. And other people might just want to have a clearer picture of how much they're gambling to help them make those choices. So I very much see our intervention at this point, or the support that we're doing with banks at the moment, at this point where we're looking to disrupt the pathways to harm, and this is very much a preventative approach. And the transaction data analysis is a bit that sits before all of those tools, because you can have all of those tools and you can have them available, but unless people know they're there or kind of directed to them, it doesn't mean that they're going to get utilised. So where banks can then do that transaction data analysis, identify people who might be struggling or who might want to be aware of these tools and then utilise them, that's where this interesting piece takes place, and how they do that transaction data analysis, what thresholds they use, what for behavioural indicators or spending indicators or affordability indicators, to go out to people and communicate with people.
Yeah, I definitely agree that. Well, you said at the beginning, it's difficult for customers to be able to track exactly how much they're spending. The banks are in a position to be able to provide that information in a very transparent way. And I really like that idea of using algorithms, but potentially being as transparent as possible. So as opposed to the bank sending someone a message saying, we've identified risky behaviors, they say very specifically, you've been gambling after midnight, which is associated with harm. You've been spending more than the average person, or you've escalated your banking, how much you're spending in. So providing very specific indicators is where it crosses from being surveillance to where I think it goes into being support and just being transparent and giving people the autonomy that they have the appropriate information to be able to make an informed decision. And then even better if the bank can then point to some specific resources. Would you like to use our would you like us to help put a block on your spend? Would you like to put a limit on your account? But I do think that it would be helpful if the banks can point that out to people very specifically, as opposed to just make it available. If you want it, it's on our website. Actually bring it to people's attention at the right period in time. I'm wondering if you can sort of talk about the extent to which that's actually happening, and what's where it is working, and if it's not in place, what's stopping this from being put in place.
So at Money Mental Health, we run the Action Lab, which brings together a collaborative of 7 financial services firms who are working together to think about how they can better support people at risk of or experiencing gambling harms. So alongside those 7 firms, so we meet on a 6-weekly basis over 18 months to hear about the common challenges they face in supporting people at risk of gambling harms. And then we've gone through a stage where they then conceptualize and design solutions and then pilot solutions. What we bring to that is our lived experience research community. So all of the problems that have surfaced. So we brought lots of the lived experience research community to the beginning of the Action Lab and shared lots of the challenges people face with the 7 firms. And then as they've gone forward and identified the common challenges they face, or they've begun to conceptualize or design their new solutions, we've taken those things back to the research community and said, what do you think to these? Do these look good? How would you change these? What do these need to look like? All of that sort of thing. So, and then we're offering ongoing consultancy to the firms to support them to get their kind of pilots over the line. So that's how the kind of Action Lab model works in itself. So when we brought firms together to identify the common challenges, I was surprised how much transaction data analysis was going on already around gambling harms. So this is work that firms have been dipping their toe in for a little while. I think the problem is that when it comes to gambling harms, it's a complex and knotty issue for banks to know how to respond to. And I think so work has been going on in the background, some work, and then it stalls, or it's been going on in silos and information isn't being shared. So the learnings, so whilst some firms have already been starting and doing a bit of transaction data analysis around gambling harms, how they've done it and the lessons they've learned, what's worked, what hasn't worked, hasn't been shared. And in a space like, obviously banks are traditionally competitive, but in a space where the vulnerability and the competition isn't the same, there's an opportunity for them really to collaborate and learn from one another and get to better solutions. So what we've sought to do through the Gambling Harms Action Lab is take firms from where they're at and move them forward in thinking about new or improved tools. So for some of the firms in the lab, that might be improving what they've already got around transaction data analysis. So for some, that could be, we're already doing transaction data analysis. This is the spending thresholds we're using or the behavioural indicators we're using, and we're supporting them to think a little bit further about how can you expand those to encompass a wider range of people where you might not be sort of only communicating with the people who are indicative of the highest risk, and asking and thinking about that. Whereas for others, it might be creating that transaction data analysis from scratch and thinking, okay, what would we want this to look like? What do the communications off the back of it look like? And then bringing them together with their peers so that they learn from one another's mistakes and successes. So transaction data analysis around gambling harms has been going on for some time for some firms in the UK, and others are beginning this journey. But I think the interesting thing for me is once we get this up and running with a sort of wider range of firms, is how we keep this on the agenda as something that continually has to be iterated. I think first models of transaction data analysis are understandably cautious. So, you might set your spending thresholds particularly high, or your behavioural indicators particularly high, because banks are trying to test the waters. They're trying to see how these land with customers, what the communication should and shouldn't look like, and different approaches like that. But I think as firms gain more confidence in this area, we can begin to expand those thresholds to encompass a wider range of people, so we can intervene at a more preventative level. And this intervention, I think people, when you think about this, people are concerned about it being paternalistic, or they're concerned that it's telling people what to do. But it's not that. It's just signposting to people tools that could be helpful to them, whether that's internal to the bank or whether that's signposting to external gambling support services. It's just bridging that gap between we've identified a challenge, or we've identified something that you might be struggling with, or maybe a risk, and here's some support tools. If people choose to do nothing with it, that's absolutely fine. But if they do, or if they want to, then those tools are there, they're available for them, and they're being made aware of it.
Yeah, and I want to surface a tension that people might be thinking about, because this is something I've no doubt you've discussed previously. Banks obviously profit from processing gambling transactions. They profit from providing credit. They bank the gambling operators to between them to some extent. So, and obviously there are the conflicts of interest between government, taxation, the commercial providers, the financial institutions. There's regulations, and now there's regulations about foreseeable harm, which have some vagaries to them. So these are all some of these are technical challenges. You could build these algorithms, you could make them, but is it profitable to do so? Where is the response, or to what extent does conflict of interest undermine this, or be proactively addressed by banks, or that's discussed in your groups?
Yeah, I think with the consumer duty from the FCA here was a bit of a game changer in the UK financial services, and it really required firms to think about good consumer outcomes and support vulnerable customers. That alongside sort of vulnerability guidance that came out a couple of years previous to that. So I think where we're thinking about vulnerability, so lots of those issues are not as prevalent. Like, it's about supporting customers, it's about spotting vulnerability, it's about supporting those people. But I also think it's in banks' interests to maintain customers who are creditworthy, and where people have gambling or are struggling with gambling, that doesn't necessarily support them remaining creditworthy. So it's in banks' interest in that sense, in one way. But then there's lots of banks, brands are pitched around, that they are supporting customers and trust and all of those kind of principles. So I think this leads into that, really. And I think for me, when we set up the Gambling Harms Action Lab, I was incredibly encouraged how many banks wanted to come on board. Like, this is something banks want to grapple with and were grappling with. I think they are vested in doing something and supporting customers. They just didn't know how to do it, and that's where we come along. We're trying to support them to collaborate to find those solutions. So there are tensions, and we can't deny that. But I think in an area of this where where we're thinking about vulnerability, where we're thinking about creditworthiness, where we're thinking about brands and trust, lots of that kind of is pushed to the side in order to, and that's how we get the traction, and that's how the banks are making their progress.
Well, I think that's great that we're having those conversations. And obviously you have this advantage in that you're speaking with people who gamble, who have experienced gambling harm. What are people telling you that they want or expect from their bank? Like, where is that line between what people would consider excessively, involved versus a supportive reminder?
Yeah. from our research community, it's been really evident that people want supportive tools from their banks, and they want their banks to proactively offer them support and provide tools that do that. I think lots of the challenge comes around the messaging and what that messaging looks like. People don't want messaging that feels judgmental or telling them what they should or shouldn't do with their money, understandably. And so that comes in quite what the nuance of that messaging is. And we've done lots of work with the research community and with banks, where we've tested banks' messaging with the research community and put their different kind of iterations of messages to them and said, what do you think to this? How could or should this be improved? So I think lots comes down to the tone and how that's done. But I've been so impressed really with the tone that banks are using, and there's different approaches. You can go out with a bit more of a universal kind of approach and say, did you know we've got these bank gambling support tools? Or you can go out with a little bit more of a direct approach and say, we can see that you've gambled 20 times this month. Here's some support. Did you know we've got some support tools here? So you can pitch it in different ways. And this is very much gets at the heart of what Action Labs is about. We're not getting to the end of this 3 years and saying that all of the things that we've tried are going to be right. This is about piloting new things, learning from it and sharing those learnings with the sector to say, this is what landed well, this is the bits that didn't land so well, and this is where you need to jump off and think about your next iteration of this. So it's as much about getting those conversations and tools started, but it's not the end game. At the end of this, we'll have something, but it can be improved on and iterated on. And that should always be done in conjunction with people with lived experience. So I think there's a clear appetite from people for gambling support tools. One of the things we're going to do, we're in the last third of the Gambling Harms Action Lab now, and we're going to be doing some national polling around the support that people want from their bank. Because obviously we've been speaking to our research community. They're an engaged community, but they are also people with a greater experience of gambling and gambling harms. So we want to go out to a kind of wider range of people to really understand that. But appetite so far are that they want support from their banks and they want those tools.
Yeah, that really reflects the research that I've done in Australia as well. And it's great that you have this action lab that's bringing banks together and being able to incorporate lived experience, and those voices are so important. I find when I'm speaking with banks, I'm often similarly engaged with the customer advocacy team or the hardship team or the welfare team who do want to support customers. However, I have spoken to other teams, but I often see there's also somewhat of a disconnect between there might be a credit team or a marketing team. Do you have any advice for anyone who's working inside a bank or wants to work with a bank? How do you think you can get that top-down or across organisational buy-in about the importance of positioning these tools in terms of empowering customers, like signposting to customers? Do you have any advice about how to best engage with financial institutions?
Yeah, I think it depends who you're talking to in financial institutions. If you're talking to vulnerability teams, they're pretty engaged already. Whereas if you're going to kind of other teams, it might be that you need to kind of lean on kind of different regulations and different requirements to a greater degree when you're kind of having these conversations. But we were reflecting the other day about the 7 reps we've got, and the Action Lab program is quite intense in as much as, and Sally, you've come along yourself, we've had guest speakers go along, and I think the reps themselves have gone on a massive journey in their gambling harms knowledge, and they've really, we're just kind of in an evaluation phase at the moment, so it'd be interesting to see the results. But, they've gone from kind of sort of minimal gambling harms knowledge, I would say, some of them, and that's really increased, and it's almost like they're going out into their institutions now with this massive amount of knowledge that they wouldn't have, and they're kind of able to be ambassadors for this, and a lot within their institution for whatever role they go into. The people we're working with won't necessarily stay in vulnerability roles or product design roles. They'll go in all sorts of things, but this knowledge will stay with them. And hopefully, as they do that, we will begin to stretch the kind of knowledge that they have and take it into different departments. So I think it's about this isn't going to happen overnight. This is a massive thing. There's huge amounts of stigma that still exist around gambling, and different bits of secrecy and stigma and shame. And I just see this as part of that. So whilst we're having these conversations with banks, we're beginning to lift that. Whilst the more we normalise banking messaging, that some comes out and says, here's some support services, here's some tools, we're all contributing to that, lifting some of that stigma and shame that keeps people in secrecy and keeps perpetuating the problem. So I think it's a movement that we're on, and we're just a really, really small part of that.
Yeah, but I think you're right that there are already parts of the bank that are doing very similar aspects. So, for example, I'm getting emails from my bank about being mindful of scams, and this is what a scam is. And when I'm trying to make a payment to someone I haven't made a payment before, at one point I had to click through about 5 different, are you really sure? Are you really, really sure? Make sure this is a payment you want to make. So there is a capacity to build in friction in a way that you can see that's in the bank's interest, because they don't want their customers to be scammed. They might be liable if you come back and say, oh, I didn't authorize this payment, my account was hacked or something. So there clearly are some examples where banks are trying to help customers make better decisions and be mindful of risks. So I think it's something that we can position and make the case for people who are gambling beyond their means, are in a similar sort of circumstance. They may benefit from additional friction. Are you sure, you've already made 2 deposits to a gambling website? Are you sure you want to authorize this one? Would you like to put a pause and come back 12 hours later? There are mechanisms in place and a rationale where banks are already acting in this way to help customers think about their and again, I think it's just that empowering customers. It's not about stopping or restricting people, but it's about ensuring that the customers have thought through their decision, and it's not an emotional response or a pressured response in some way.
Yeah, absolutely. And your fraud examples a really good one, and we talk about that quite a lot in our work. When you kind of talk to people, the initial thought is, oh, my bank's going to comb through my data and say what I should and shouldn't spend my money on. Like that doesn't give you a great reaction. But banks are already doing lots of this stuff in this fraud space that we're welcoming. Where they see unusual transactions, they're just double checking with you. You sure you want to make this payment? Are you sure you know who this person is? Type thing. And this is very similar. It's not somebody, an individual person looking through all of your data. It's algorithms spotting patterns and just highlighting things to support you. And I think, the more we get comfortable with that and how our data isn't used, and how we give permission for how our data to be used, it's being used in lots of ways in all of the time. And for us, it's about thinking about how that data can be used for consumer good and how we can expand that to be used for consumer good.
Absolutely. Oh, Nikki, there's so many more areas I could go into, but I'm very mindful of your time. So last question I want to ask you is, if you could change one thing, whether it be a bank policy or a regulation, what do you think would make the biggest difference to people experiencing gambling harms?
I think the biggest thing that would make a difference to people experiencing or at risk of gambling harms is banks using their transaction data to identify people. But I think this needs to be done across the board. I think this is something, it's great that we've got some firms doing some of this, but this is about raising the standard across the sector. This is stuff that can be done. The template is there in lots of different areas, as you've just talked about. And this is something that people should be able to expect from their bank, and they should be able to turn on things that are going to help them. It's the very minimum that we should be able to do to help to manage our finances. So I would like to see what comes out of the Gambling Harms Action Lab. I'd like to see those learnings and lessons be applied across the sector, so that all customers, whoever you bank with, have support have access to support. Whether they choose to use it, that's their choice, but they have the access to support. And I think the consumer duty, so the regulation sits there to allow firms to do this. I think it's about taking those steps and being confident and operationalizing it, really.
Oh, definitely. And I think that if you are working in a financial institution, there are lots of researchers who and groups who would be very happy to work with you to assist with some of these initiatives. It doesn't have to be something that's done by themselves. Look, Nikki, I close each episode with 2 quick questions, a resource recommendation and someone you're following. So what is a book, a report, or a resource that you would recommend for anyone who wants to learn more about this area?
So I'm going to flip that question around because you mentioned the person earlier who I would recommend anybody read on this matter if you're interested in what banks should do, and that would be Naomi Muggleton's paper about bank gambling data and financial data and outcomes and how banks can support people better. I think that's the first paper, and lots of our work is based upon that. So anybody that's interested in transaction data should look at that paper. And then in terms of a resource, for me, we're really speaking to banks. So for any Australian-based banks, I would suggest, beyond looking at Naomi's paper, take a look at our resources on our webpage, the First Line of Defence paper that you mentioned earlier, where we take lots of the work of Naomi's work and really think about how that can be applied to a banking sector, what some of your thresholds could or should be, and really reiterate your point. Like, academics are really keen to work in this space, and you wouldn't necessarily be doing this alone. So do reach out to the people working in this field and ourselves, and we're always keen to support people.
Oh, I so appreciate your time, Nikki. What this conversation has really shown again for me after we've spoken previously is that so much energy has been placed on what an individual needs to do differently. But I really love the work that you're doing that highlights the institutions in the middle and the banks or financial institutions that have the data, they have the relationships, they have that contact point, and they have that profit motive of wanting customers to be able to be sustainable and making sound decisions so they have a long-term engagement with the banking. Obviously. So I think that there's really a role that has started, which is amazing, and congratulations to you and your group for progressing that. But there is a lot more that could be done. So I really appreciate your time and being so willing to share these. We'll link to all those resources in the show notes. That's Nikki Bond, head of the Gambling Harms Action Lab at Money and Mental Health Policy Institute in the UK. One of the clearest thinkers and people working on what financial services can and should be doing about gambling harm. I really love this conversation because it puts the emphasis not on the individual to have to be responsible for tracking everything, but showing that other institutions like finance institutions where people bank can play a role in signposting to people when they're gambling, might need closer attention and providing some resources because they do have that global view of what people are spending, as well as the ability to connect directly with customers and have a trusting relationship. I encourage you to look at the Money and Mental Health Policy Institute's website, which is moneyandmentalhealth.org, particularly at the reports, and we'll link them in the show notes today. I hope you've enjoyed this episode of the Technology Risk and Gambling podcast. It's available on YouTube, but also on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and wherever you listen. If this series is useful to you, I would love it if you could please share it. If you could leave a comment or a 5-star rating and subscribe so you don't miss out on any other content. This episode was brought to you by BetWell, which is a brand new tool we're launching to help people manage and look at their gambling spend. This episode was recorded on the lands of the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation. I recognise and pay respects to the elders and the communities, past, present and emerging, on these lands and on the lands on which you are listening. The podcast is produced by the Technology Addiction team at the Brain and Mind Centre, and my sincere thank you to the production support from Eunice, Huynh and Fergus, Lyons. I'm Sally Gainsbury. Thanks for listening.